Hello and welcome once again to the Spouter-Inn. I'm Chris.
And I'm Suzanne. And in celebration of its 100th birthday, I've been rereading The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald.
Well, I've been reading the classic science fiction novel Solaris by Stanisław Lem. So this should be fun. Listeners, please come on, get yourself a drink, pull up a seat, and join us for a conversation about these books and more here at the Spouter-Inn. We are recording this a little bit late in the month, but nevertheless, it's still June. Happy Pride.
Happy Pride.
And it's a slightly, sad Pride. I guess Pride is a complicated thing in a lot of ways.
It's always complicated, and I feel like this year is complicated in more ways than usual.
Yeah. But one specific sad note is that the writer Edmund White passed away earlier this month. And had you read much by him?
I can't say much because he's so prolific. Like, he's written so much stuff. Though I have read a few things. I particularly remember reading A Boy's Own Story, which I really, really got a lot out of. And then also his first novel, Forgetting Elena, I absolutely loved when I read it as a young person. So I'm hoping to reread it sometime in the next few weeks.
It was very interesting because a lot of the obituaries mentioned Forgetting Elena as like his standout book. And I hadn't heard of that, even having looked into him a bit. And I think I read either A Boy's Own Story or The Beautiful Room is Empty back in the day. So apparently this is a really good book that I probably should be on my radar, huh?
Well, I think it's kind of funny because if I'm not mistaken, it looks like it got, kind of like mixed, like it got some attention when it came out, but kind of a little bit mixed reviews, kind of. It didn't have a huge impact. And I think it's only later that it started to get more and more recognition. A Boy's Own Story is it's fiction, but it's also kind of a memoir. Like it's got a lot of first person weight kind of to it,
Right.
And that, was made a very big impact. He co-wrote The Joy of Gay Sex in the 1970s. That also got a lot of visibility. And his biographies and his memoirs, they've gotten a lot of attention. And I think Forgetting Elena is starting to be seen a little bit differently. And that's interesting in itself as well. You haven't peeked into it at all, have you?
No.
So it's pretty short, and it's written in this really very, very, very beautiful prose style. But the premise of it is kind of bizarre. It's the first-person character has faulty memory, so he doesn't know where he is and exactly how he's supposed to behave. So he's constantly looking at and reading the people around him, and this is taking place out in some house party out in Fire Island, to know what the cues are and what he's supposed to be doing. And so some people find that kind of irritating, but I was absolutely fascinated, I remember, by this whole idea that you could kind of read what was around you and try to make people think you understood more than you did about what was going on. So as a young person, of course, this was fantastic, right? Because that's basically what you're doing your whole, young adult life, right? Is trying to make it look like you know what you're doing.
Sure, yeah.
And it's just, like I said, the prose style is exquisite. So I hope we get a chance to talk about it sometime.
Interesting. All right, well, that sounds really exciting, and I should, especially because it's a short novel, and you got to love a short novel.
Yeah, absolutely. So maybe we'll have a chance to talk about it another time.
Yeah, maybe. But I guess we should start talking about these books. The Great Gatsby. I think some people have been waiting a long time for us to cover this book.
Better late than never. When they met again 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her, curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. So I felt like it was really tricky to come up with a good quotation because it's such a quotable and much quoted book. You know what I mean? There are a number of passages that really represent the book in a certain kind of way, but they're I don't want to say cliches, but they're so well known that you kind of bounce off them. And one of the things that strikes me about this book, and I'm going to be curious as to whether it strikes you that way, is it seems to me more than anything else about money and about classes and about the hopelessness of the American dream, I guess you could say. And I know other writers deal with this kind of problem as well, but I don't think anybody deals with it in quite the intimate and sometimes shocking way that Fitzgerald deals with it. So, like, I wouldn't say it's like a favorite book of mine. Like, it's not a book I love, I guess, but it's a book that every time I reread it, I'm like, wow, great job. Yeah, no, I mean, like, it's relatively short, it's concise. It's really carefully crafted. Like, there are all these interesting symmetries and like underlying structural features that you don't notice because it's so graceful. It's like, they used to say of, good dressmaking, back when women's dresses were like very constructed, like really good dressmaking would make you look amazing, but it wouldn't look like the dress was doing it. It would just be kind of invisible. The book is like that. It's incredibly good dressmaking.
Interesting. For listeners who maybe somehow haven't read it, do you want to quickly go over what the book is about plot-wise?
Yeah, sure. I can summarize the plot. So it's summer 1922. And Nick Carraway, our narrator, is working in Manhattan while living out on Long Island in the fancy, but not too fancy suburb of West Egg, which is located just across the harbor from affluent East Egg. There, the rich and careless people live, including Nick's second cousin, Daisy Buchanan, whom he hasn't seen for years and years. Nick is a not very reliable narrator, but he does turn out to be a reliable friend to his next-door neighbor, the mysterious Jay Gatsby, who holds enormous, opulent, decadent parties at his estate on the weekends. Nick is enlisted, along with Daisy's close friend Jordan Baker, to help Jay Gatsby get a few minutes alone with Daisy, whom he knew, it turns out, years ago back in Louisville, Kentucky. Daisy's husband, the lumbering and hulkish and white supremacist, Tom Buchanan, stands in the way, although he also has his own marital entanglements going on. Above all, this novel is about money. Those who have it, those who don't, and the violence that percolates between and across social classes. So that's kind of a summary. I was really careful to leave out spoilers because I know probably not many people have read it, but if you haven't read it, the spoilers are really like, these plot features are really exciting to encounter. So I don't want to ruin those.
So before we get further into it, I should say sort of my relationship with The Great Gatsby, which is that it's one of those novels that you grow up hearing so much about. And I never got assigned it as a high school assignment, though I understood that was a thing that could happen, that it was one of those books that gets assigned to high schoolers, which is wild to me, but we'll talk about that. And so I never fully encountered it, but as a studious little, book nerd, I did pick it up a couple times to try to read it, and I always bounced off it almost immediately. It is a very short book, but I did not get very far into it before going like, I'm not enjoying any of this. I'm going to put it down. So I've never fully read it until for this podcast because you said you were going to do it. I was like, all right, let me hunker down and get through this very short and not challenging to read novel.
So like when you bounced off it, like can you describe what you were bouncing off of? Like what was it? Because not with this book, but I have totally had that experience where I'm reading something and I'm like, I just cannot get into this book.
I mostly feel like I just didn't care about any of the characters or situations I were into. And I wasn't finding the prose exciting enough to carry me on its own. And I can't even say because I don't remember how far I got into the book when I read it as a kid. I don't feel like I made it through the first chapter, which is, shockingly immediate for putting something down, I guess.
Oh, but that happens, right? Because, when we read a book and we're talking about our reading experience, like sometimes it's like, this is a good book, this is a bad book, this is well written, this is not well written. But it's also like, I don't want to say like alchemical, but it's also like, you meet the book, right? In the same way when you meet people, you sometimes take to people and you don't take to people. Like books are like that too.
Sure.
So it's like the combination of reader and book, right? That something happens there, I think. And that's kind of interesting to notice and think about as well.
And so when I was reading it this time, like I did manage to finish it. And there were definitely moments I enjoyed along the way. Although I still left the book feeling like this just isn't for me. And I'm not sure, like I left the book not feeling entirely sure why people love the book as much as they clearly do. And I respect the fact that they love it, but I don't feel like I have an insight having read the book as to what the dang appeal of the book is.
Yeah. I wonder if one of the reasons that from the first time I read it, I was like, oh, this is beautifully done. Like I really appreciated it as, like I said, like beautiful dressmaking, was because I got to it in a slightly funny way. I got to it through Hemingway's Movable Feast. Now, you remember we talked about that book together ages and ages ago, and we talked a little bit about there are a few chapters in A Movable Feast where Hemingway talks about Fitzgerald. If I remember correctly, there's a chapter that we talked about where they have extensive discussions about Fitzgerald's manhood, which he needs Hemingway to help him check and make sure it's okay. You remember that?
Yes.
Anyway, but there are other sections in the passages where Hemingway is talking about Fitzgerald. They're both in Paris together in the 1920s, and he talked particularly about Gatsby. And so I read Movable Feast for the first time as a young person, like in my teens. I kind of got to it from Hemingway, and not just from his kind of recommendation, but from the things Hemingway liked.
Right.
So it's one passage in particular that kind of sticks in my mind where Hemingway says this. He says, he spoke slightingly, talking about Fitzgerald, he spoke slightingly but without bitterness of everything he had written, and I knew his new book must be very good for him to speak without bitterness of the faults of past books. He wanted me to read the new book, The Great Gatsby, as soon as he could get his last and only copy back from someone he had loaned it to. To hear him talk of it, you would never know how very good it was, except that he had the shyness about it that all non-conceited writers have when they have done something very fine. And he says, and I hoped I'd get it soon. And then he reads the book, and he says, when I'd finished the book, I knew that no matter what Scott did, nor how he behaved, I must know it was like a sickness. Here he's talking about his alcoholism. I knew it was like a sickness, and I must be of any help I could to him and try to be a good friend. If he could write a book as fine as The Great Gatsby, I was sure he could write an even better one. I did not know Zelda yet, and so I did not know the terrible odds that were against him.
Jesus.
I know.
Okay.
It's like, oh, okay. But there are other passages as well where Hemingway is talking about the book in particular. And so I thought, oh, well, that's really interesting. And so I guess when I read The Great Gatsby for the first time, I was kind of reading it with the point of reference of Hemingway's writing, which is much sparer, many fewer adjectives, right? Something we talked about in the past. But with the bones that are the kind of thing that Hemingway would find really, really appealing. Anyway, so that's for me, that was kind of why I always saw this book as like a piece of craftsmanship as opposed to anything else.
Interesting.
I don't want to go into detail about Fitzgerald's biography, but it is, I think, important to have a little bit of a sense of a couple aspects of it because I think those are really relevant to like the structure of Great Gatsby. One of them have to do with his wife, Zelda Sayre, who I mentioned just briefly and who Hemingway speaks about in Movable Feast. There's the passage I just mentioned, and also there's a very evocative passage. I'm not going to quote it quite correctly, but where he describes her as being like a hawk. And in the same way, hawks have very beautiful eyes, but they're kind of cold and heartless. Hemingway says, and they don't share what they catch. And, so that's
he's jealous. Hemingway's just jealous of this.
He totally is. Anyway, we'll bracket that whole thing. But it's true though that it's clear that Fitzgerald and his wife Zelda were had a very close and intimate relationship, but they were both alcoholics, and their life was very, very tumultuous, in part because of her mental illness. So Fitzgerald, born in 1896, dies in 1940, comes from Minnesota. So he's out from, upper Midwest, but educated out east. He went to a Catholic prep school in New Jersey and then went to Princeton. And he goes into the Army, leaves Princeton and goes into the Army during World War I. And he wrote, like his working life was all as a writer. He wrote for magazines as well as writing his novels. And then the latter part of his life, he was in Hollywood where he was writing screenplays. He actually wrote a whole bunch of screenplays. And during this later period, his wife, Zelda, who was also a writer, suffered from mental illness severe enough that she was hospitalized. And at the age of 44, Scott Fitzgerald dies of a heart attack and alcoholism. And in 1940, and then Zelda dies 8 years later in a fire in the hospital she was confined to. So it's like, it's a kind of a short and tragic biography in some ways, but it produced some incredibly beautiful writing that I think is kind of unique. Like, I don't know if this is a stupid thing to say or not, but I don't know anybody else who writes in quite this flavor. I think it's a very distinctive flavor.
And my sense of things is that The Great Gatsby was not especially successful when it first came out.
Actually, and that is, I think, a really important point. Like we think I was going to say we think of it, but maybe a better thing to say is it is often described as like the great American novel or something like that. Like it has this kind of representative status. And that was not something that was there at the outset. I mean, it was not particularly well received. It didn't sell very many copies. But then it becomes big, like about 20 years later, because it gets distributed during World War II to U.S. soldiers for free. They had this thing called Armed Services Editions, which were like just pocket-sized, inexpensive paperbacks that they would just give the guys, right? So they have something to read. And so in 1945, 155,000 copies of The Great Gatsby were distributed for free, right? And,
Amazing.
I know. And that, I would love to know what was going on there. Like, how did that get selected? How did that get out there?
Yeah.
And that was the thing that like made it click, because after that, it's just known, and for some reason is striking a kind of a note for people.
So, but like, why did all these soldiers love this book?
I don't know.
It's so confusing to me.
And yet also, even though the book didn't get picked up all that much, clearly there was some sense that there was something there, because immediately as soon as the book comes out, a play is made of it, and then also a movie, a silent movie of it in 1926, which is now lost, tragically. The trailer still exists, but the movie's gone. And my favorite factoid, I must just say parenthetically, about the 1926 movie is the person who plays the narrator, Nick Carraway, is Neil Hamilton, best known for playing, I don't know if you know who, Batman, Commissioner Gordon.
Oh,
yes, Commissioner Gordon earlier in life, from the TV show in the 1960s.
Yeah.
He played Nick Carraway in the 1926 silent film. Isn't that awesome?
That's fun. That's fun.
I was delighted when I discovered that fact. Anyway, and of course, so in other words, as well as the more recent movies like the 1974 movie and then the later 2013 movie that many people might have seen, already at the very beginning, it was recognized as having that kind of cinematic quality. And I thought that was kind of interesting. But it only takes off after the war. And maybe that's because there's a kind of attentiveness to this class issue that I think is in the book, and it's kind of embedded in a sort of elegiac love story about the American dream. But it's quite violent just under the surface, too.
Oh, I mean, not just under the surface. It's pretty violent on the surface at times.
I guess what I mean is that the violence of what happens to the individual characters, like that's all on the surface. But the fact that this is sort of built into the culture, I don't know, maybe it isn't all that much below the surface. There's a lot of it anyway. I
mean, I also think about how Gatsby, the character, is someone who sort of, I guess this might count as spoilers, but like someone who grows up poor and then goes off to the army to reinvent himself and comes home to become the person he most dreams of being one way or another. He's going to become the fabulous, wealthy person who can do what they want, who can make their will known in the world, or at least can try to. And that will is entirely focused on Daisy Buchanan. Daisy, this girl that he left behind when he went off to war and lost because of that and is going to win back.
Yeah. And it's kind of interesting the way you're putting it, like he lost her because he went away to war, but which is true. But it's also because there's this sort of social gap that he can never bridge. Like he's got this tremendous aspiration to make something of himself, but to make something of himself because that will get him Daisy. But Daisy is kind of this infinitely receding, target almost. On the horizon, right? And so he can never catch up, right? He can never quite attain what he's looking for.
Yes, exactly. There's a kind of futility towards chasing after the horizon. He goes through all the trouble of somehow buying the home that looks directly across the bay at her house and sees her on the horizon every night. But of course, you can't reach the horizon.
Yeah. And it's kind of neat how the book again, the craftsmanship, the book really sets this up. One of the things that's kind of interesting and I think kind of freaky about it is that we don't actually encounter the character of Gatsby until like kind of belatedly. We learn about the other characters. Like we start out with Nick Carraway, who's the narrator. Like, so we're with him from the outset and we get a sense of where he's living. He's got this mysterious neighbor with this magnificent house and the parties, but we don't know. He's like in the shadows, right?
Right.
And we know about Nick's cousin Daisy because they're living just across the bay, and he goes over and visits his cousin Daisy and her husband Tom, who he knew back in college and all that kind of stuff, right? So that they get introduced, and also Daisy's good friend Jordan Baker that Nick develops a kind of relationship with, so we get to all of that and the whole setup with Myrtle Wilson and her husband. Tom is having an affair with Myrtle, and so we get that all kind of like set up. We don't get to Gatsby until really belatedly, and Nick even doesn't know who he's talking to at the party, and he finally figures out that this is actually Gatsby. And the fact that it's so deferred, I think, is really important because it makes him obscure, so we kind of partake in this, like, confusion or, like, gradual unveiling that Nick is participating in. And then we also kind of come along for this vision of what Daisy is to Gatsby, right? So Nick is real close with Daisy because that's his relative, but he kind of, how can I put it? He imaginatively also sees her at a distance because he sees the green light on the dock, right? Where Daisy and Tom's house is across the way, there's a green light on the dock. And this green light comes up over and over. It's like, this is what makes the book so good for like high school classes, I guess, is like, you can be like, what is the symbolism of the green light? It's like,
right.
Like this is, you would never choose this for your quotation, right? Because it's just like, oh God. But there's still something really interesting going on there in terms of like time and this receding goal thing, right?
Well, yeah. And I mean, and in danger of walking through high school assignment analysis, like the way you're describing it, like Gatsby, as you say, we meet the effect of Gatsby well before we meet Gatsby himself. And quite a lot of the book is like kind of Nick trying to get at the core of like, well, wait, who is this guy? Right? Like, let's move away from the effect of like the house and the parties at the house next door. And then the occasional wild things that people say about him because they don't know who he is really.
Yeah. They have all these crazy theories, right, as to who he really is.
Yeah. And like, let's get at the person behind all of that. And then by the time you do that, again, kind of spoilers, it's too late. Like it's gone. It's just poof. What little there seems to actually have been there has been so withered by the edifice of Gatsby, the fabulous wealthy person that he's built around it that like there's no real there inside. And similarly, when he looks over at Daisy, it's Gatsby's fantasies about the outward projection of Daisy, right? He's not fantasizing about Daisy, the complicated individual person. It's like this beautiful thing that he can't have, this wealthy thing that he can't have, and then this effect that he stares at from across a bay for years before actually conniving a way of making contact with her.
Yeah. No, you're saying two super interesting things there. And one of them is that there's this kind of cinematic or almost illusory or phantasmagorical quality to what it is that Gatsby is producing with the house and the parties, but also what he's pursuing is also a kind of phantasm, right? And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why, we were talking about earlier about how even though the book wasn't all that incredibly popularly received, it generated a play and a movie almost straight away because that cinematic illusory quality of the book like asks for, you know what I mean? Like it is itself play-like or film-like because it's an illusion.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
That's at the center of the book. So I wonder about that. And the other thing is like, you're absolutely right, like the ways in which the illusion proves to be something you absolutely cannot grasp, right? I mean, by definition, you can't grasp it. And there's this one moment that I find particularly interesting that kind of brings that out. It's when Nick has managed to arrange a secret get-together for Daisy and Gatsby at his place, right? And so they have some conversation, and Gatsby and Daisy are talking together, and Gatsby says, you always have a green light that burns all night at the end of your dock. Daisy put her arm through his abruptly, but he seemed absorbed in what he had just said. Possibly it had occurred to him that the colossal significance of that light had now vanished forever. Compared to that great distance that had separated him from Daisy, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her. It had seemed as close as a star to the moon. Now it was again a green light on a dock. His count of enchanted objects had diminished by one.
Mm.
And I find that passage like really interesting. And like, I don't even quite know if I've like understood the different levels of it. One thing is that like, he's apparently got her now. Like she put her arm through his, like they're together. But the light, like that kind of imaginative projection of what he's trying to get, it's gone. And his count of enchanted objects had diminished by one. So almost like there's this thing he's been aspiring toward, and like now he's got her, like now what?
Yeah.
Right, so there's that. And then also, what's the relationship between Daisy and the light? Well, he says, it had seemed very near to her, almost touching her, as close as a star to the moon. But like stars and the moon are like nowhere near each other, right?
True.
Right? Yeah. So what it's doing, it's a very Wallace Stevens kind of thing, right? Like that constellations at Key West poem, right? Like they're actually nowhere near each other, but they look like that to you.
Right.
right? And so so like that's how you remember the craftsmanship. There's like, superficially it looks like, oh, the symbol of the green light, and it is really obvious on one level, but also there's something really weird just under the surface.
I mean, I will say that when I read that passage, I did feel it was very appropriate. It was very true that like Gatsby getting to finally sort of intimately touch, embracing arms or whatever, but like intimately touch this woman that he's been fantasizing about for so long.
Oh, yeah.
And then it would be like, that would be a loss because he no longer has access to fantasy Daisy. He's just got this woman.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And like what he wants is to join her in fantasy.
Yes.
Not have her join him in reality.
I think that's exactly right. And there's this one flashback, like the whole last part of the book has a whole bunch of like, I don't want to say flashbacks, but we keep moving back in time. Like the narrator will say, oh, let me tell you about this thing from back here.
Right.
So it does this really interesting timeline mixing up in the last sections of the book. And one of them comes when Nick Carraway is talking with Gatsby and they're talking about the past. And Nick says, you can't repeat the past. And Gatsby says, can't repeat the past. Why, of course you can. And so that, of course, tells you something about what it is he's this impossibility of what he's trying to get to. And then we hear right in that passage about what happened 5 years before. And there's this really strange passage. This is Nick Carraway sort of summarizing what Gatsby perceived at this time 5 years ago. So when he first was in love with Daisy. He knew that when he kissed this girl and forever wed his unutterable visions to her perishable breath, his mind would never romp again like the mind of God. All right, first of all. Then he kissed her. At his lips' touch, she blossomed for him like a flower, and the incarnation was complete. And, like my note says, WTF, right? I'm like, what is going on there? Like she's representing attainment itself. Like she's representing this moment, which is simultaneously fulfillment. The incarnation was complete, but also like a loss. Like it's kind of like, I don't know, a fall, or it's some rupture. His mind would never romp again like the mind. And it's because having the thing is never as satisfying as the wanting, right? I mean, it's only as long as it's in front of you that it's still the thing you want, right? Anyway, so it's like, yeah. I know, it's like kind of depressing, right? It's like, oh God, But I guess this is how people, I guess this is how people are, or some people are. I don't know.
I mean, yes, and fair enough, and all signs point to a certain depressed attitude of Fitzgerald, and fair enough. We could get into that, but that's not maybe what I want to. What I'm still curious about is like, again, sort of the reception of this, like this depressing little book, because like it doesn't work. Like Gatsby is trying to attain some vision of the American dream, and it fails. Mm-hmm. Like, is that the story that the soldiers coming home from war were excited to pass on to everybody else?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And so it has to be the case that we're supposed to see Gatsby as like a failure and not a failure, right? A failure in the sense that like he's dead at the end of the book. He hasn't attained what he was trying, like he hasn't continued to, like he kind of maybe touched Daisy, but he hasn't grasped Daisy, right? He didn't.
Yeah, it falls apart almost immediately.
It falls apart immediately, right? People don't come to his funeral, right? Like it's like a catastrophe in a sense. But at the same time, our narrator, right, because that's the person who's sort of bringing us through the book, is clearly still really attached to him. The last words he says to Gatsby right before Nick Carraway goes off into the city to work, and he never sees Gatsby again because he dies while he's away. He says, you're worth the whole lot of them. And he says how glad I was that I said that to him. So it must be that somehow the appeal is funneled through the narrator character, because the narrator has this high regard for Gatsby, like for his I don't know what it is, his ability to hold on to that ideal. And then I think this is a really important detail. Nick Carraway goes back out west.
Yes.
He kind of basically abandons the East Coast, right? He says, after Gatsby's death, the East was haunted for me like that, distorted beyond my eyes' power of correction. So when the blue smoke of brittle leaves was in the air and the wind blew the wet laundry stiff on the line, I decided to come back home. Right? So he's kind of like rejecting it.
Yeah.
He says he continues to dream about it, but it's like, He says, I see now, he says, that this has been a story of the West after all. Tom and Gatsby, Daisy and Jordan and I were all Westerners, and perhaps we possess some deficiency in common which made us subtly unadaptable to Eastern life.
Yeah.
So, you know what I mean? So there's this kind of weird thing, like you go out here and it sends you back into like the heartland, right? So I kid you not, this is what's going on, right?
It is, and I cannot say that I loved that part of the book.
No, but I mean, that's got to be, if you try to think about what is it that people are responding to, that's got to be part of it, right?
Well, all right, but I want to add a few more shades to that picture because, as you say, Nick tries to be there for Gatsby, tells him some positive things. But even while he's doing that, I don't have the passage at hand, but like somewhere in that bit where he says that very nice thing that he's so glad that he said, he also talks about how kind of despicable he finds Gatsby.
I think I'll have to check. I think that's when he still, is that when he still thinks that Gatsby is the one who was driving the car?
It might be.
Maybe you're right.
But the vibes I got from that were that there was something sort of fundamentally kind of attractive about Gatsby and kind of off-putting about him. That he had kind of these two different modes, but that there was still something compelling him to be, kind and think through who Gatsby was and ensure that his funeral would be well populated, that, he had friends or something like that. So Nick Carraway, our main character, is kind of in the tradition of these main characters who are kind of blank slates. There's kind of nothing that exciting about Nick. He just happens to be an observer of so much of this. He's also like involved in it. Like he's part of Jay's connection to Daisy, I guess. But like fundamentally, Nick isn't there to propel the plot. He's there to report on the plot and respond and react to it, right?
That's right, yeah.
But what is Nick's relationship with Gatsby like? And there's one really weird and fascinating moment that I absolutely grabbed onto and started looking up what people's responses were at the end of, I believe it's chapter 2.
Oh, yeah.
When Nick has gone to a party and like it's a weird, awkward party and Tom, the white supremacist guy that Daisy's married to, is there with his mistress and ends up like punching her in the face and breaking her nose. It's terrible. And it all unwinds, and then Nick ends up, and there's this little like coda to the chapter that doesn't explain itself very much, but apparently needed to be there, where he ends up in the apartment of a photographer, a male but feminine appearing photographer, Chester McKee, and he's in his boxers. And it's like, wait, did they hook up? Wait, what happened here?
Yeah. It is absolutely, you absolutely cannot unsee it. The first time you notice what's going on in that passage, afterward, you're like, wait, what?
Yeah.
Because everybody is super drunk, right? So you kind of know that, to expect that the incoherence and gaps, that's sort of reflecting the way the narrator is, right? But at the same time, it's like hard to miss. So I just pulled up this passage while you were talking. So Nick and this guy, the photographer, Mr. McKee, they leave, they go out the door. Come to lunch someday, he suggested as we groaned down on the elevator. Where? Anywhere. Keep your hands off the lever, snapped the elevator boy. I beg your pardon, said Mr. McKee with dignity. I didn't know I was touching it. All right, I agreed.
God.
I'd be glad to. I know. And then ... I was standing beside his bed and he was sitting up between the sheets, clad in his underwear with a great portfolio in his hands. And he's got and that's like,
Happy Pride, everybody.
Happy Pride, right? Beauty and the Beast, Loneliness, Old Grocery Store, Brooklyn Bridge. Then I was lying half asleep in the cold lower level of the Pennsylvania station, staring at the morning Tribune and waiting for the 4:00 train.
Yeah.
Now the drunk part, like I think, like, and that kind of other ellipsis, it's not literally ... but like, we go from there to being passed out and Penn Station at 4 a.m. I mean, who has not had that experience, right?
Indeed.
So I think that is happening too, but and yet we are definitely invited to think something's gone on there, right? So like it's part of that aspect of his character that I think is so interesting. Like he is the narrator and he's the one who takes us along and he's there to watch and observe. That's totally true. He moves things along a little bit when he facilitates the meeting of Gatsby and Daisy, and then also later on he's going to be the one who makes the arrangements when Gatsby is dead, and he speaks with Gatsby's father, and he tries to get people to cover the funeral. But other than that, he's like this iceberg, right, where we see a little bit of what's above the surface, but there's all this other stuff.
Exactly, because we get that sort of mentioned but not fully explained. And I mean, there are plenty of people out there who are trying to insist that that isn't a hookup. But I don't know what it is then. They don't seem to have any good answers.
Keep your hands off my elevator lever, guy.
Quite a portfolio he's got in his lap.
Oh my God. I know. How can you unsee that, right? It's just crazy.
But then also when Nick finally sees Jay, he's crushing pretty hard on that pretty boy.
Yeah, definitely. It's complicated, right? Like that passage you were mentioning a little while ago when, Nick says those last words to Jay Gatsby. It kind of captures some of that ambiguity, right? He said, "They're a rotten crowd," I shouted across the lawn. "You're worth the whole damn bunch put together." I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him because I disapproved of him from beginning to end.
Yes.
Right? First he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. Right? So it's like this, again, you gotta give him credit for this, right? This craftsmanship, right? So he can be both, Nick Carraway can be both judgmental of Gatsby and see all the problems, and yet he's just in love with that radiant and understanding smile, right? We've been in ecstatic cahoots all the time. So that, I don't know, that's that balance, right? That like precarious little balance. It's like, a teeter-totter or something like that, where you could stand on this side and that side and you kind of can keep it balanced. It's a bit like that.
Yeah, exactly. So like, there's a sense of like what Nick's relationship with Gatsby is more than just like, oh, this neighbor who's notorious who I hung out with and now we're it's like there's something more going on with it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, is Gatsby to Nick what Daisy is to Gatsby, kind of a thing. And now when all possibility is squelched, he has to give up and go home.
Yeah. Well, it's all a way of talking about longing, right? And like, and I think that, if you imagine like there being a major key and a minor key, there's the major key is Gatsby's longing for Daisy and the green light and all that stuff. And then there's Nick's longing, which shows up kind of in a minor key in all these moments, right? And above all in his relationship with Gatsby.
So is this what we're teaching kids?
Yeah, I know.
I don't have a problem with kids learning about longing. That's fine. But it just seems like a strange book to add to the high school curriculum.
Well, I have to assume that the reason it shows up in curriculum is because it's short, right? And it's got these like aspects that you can, like the symbolism things, like the we talked about the green light, the billboard that has the two eyes, the giant eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, right? There's a way in which you can analyze those things. Like you could teach an 8th grader to analyze those things, right? So sure. I mean, in fact, there's really complicated things going on with those. Like they run through the whole text in a really complicated kind of way. But, so I guess that's why you teach it. I don't know, man. I think, but if you're teaching it though, I don't know how you do it without influencing their little minds in a dangerous way. I'm thinking about Socrates getting in big trouble for corrupting the youth of Athens. I mean, how do you teach this book without corrupting the youth of Athens? I do not know.
Well, and also, what do you do about Tom?
Oh, yes. Yes, a very unattractive character.
Yeah. Extremely unattractive in a way that I'm not 100% convinced all the readers who read this and enthused about it recognized how unattractive Tom was.
Absolutely. Because, he's first of all, he's quite thuggish. In the 1974 movie of The Great Gatsby, he's played by Bruce Dern, which I'm like, chef's kiss, right? That's perfect. Right? So like the physical description of him, this is very early in the book. He was a sturdy, straw-haired man of 30 with a rather hard mouth and a supercilious manner. 2 shining, arrogant eyes had established dominance over his face and gave him the appearance of always leaning aggressively forward. Not even the effeminate swank of his riding clothes could hide the enormous power of that body. He seemed to fill those glistening boots until he strained the top lacing, and you could see a great pack of muscle shifting when his shoulder moved under his thin coat. It was a body capable of enormous leverage, a cruel body. So first of all, that. But then when they're all sitting down for dinner, he starts saying things that everybody else at the table sees as being maybe in bad taste to say out loud. So they're chatting. And then civilization's going to pieces, broke out Tom violently. I've gotten to be a terrible pessimist about things. Have you read The Rise of the Colored Empires by this man Goddard?
Yeah.
Why no, I replied. rather surprised by his tone, and it goes on, right? And it's not, I think you're right, because this is the 20s, right? I think it's not that everybody disagrees, but everybody is like, oh my God, why are you talking about this?
Yeah. I mean, again, I'm not a teacher. I'm not a high school literature teacher.
Yeah. How do you do that in class? I have no idea.
Yeah. But like, yeah, how do you deal with all of that in the classroom, or do you just ignore it? I mean, I don't know. I
guess you must probably lean into the fact that everybody else doesn't like him talking about it, and I don't know what you do with this, honest to God, without really opening it up and all its ugliness, right?
And I should also say, I don't know what you do in 2025 if you're teaching this book in a high school classroom, but but what do you do in 1965 if you're teaching this book in a high school classroom? That's when it was in the classrooms a lot, I think. So
I assume I assume it was dealt with in that period in the 60s, 70s, 80s by kind of bringing out how Tom is not a character that that you see him as a villainous character. But that actually, I think, is very inconsistent with what Fitzgerald's doing with Tom toward the end of the book. Because not that we ever like him, he's still a hulking jerk, but we're meant to empathize with him, when he's really upset about the death of Myrtle and stuff like that. So I think I don't think you can comfort yourself with this Tom is bad view.
Yeah, I did not get the impression that I was supposed to dislike Tom as much as I did, though obviously you are supposed to dislike him. I don't know.
Yeah, he's violent. I mean, he's incredibly violent, right?
Yeah. Listeners, if you have experiences being taught this book in high school and you want to write in and tell me about it, please do. Spouter@megaphonic.fm.
What did you think of the Jordan Baker character? She's, I think, probably in some ways the most interesting character in the book.
So Jordan Baker is a tennis player, right?
Yeah, she plays tennis and golf, and she's a close friend from way back with Daisy, and she's sort of always staying in other people's houses.
Yeah, and she's very sort of flapper, liberated woman of the 20s. She's meant to have that kind of excitement to her.
But she's also a big liar.
I enjoyed her well enough. I was kind of curious to see where the book was going with her. And I'm not 100% sure that I found a satisfactory answer, except that, this is the person that Nick Carraway, kind of has a few dates with and kind of has a few feelings for, but it doesn't go anywhere. And what does that mean, especially in terms of all the other things that are going on with Nick's character? I'm not sure. Did something about Jordan strike you in particular?
Well, there's this one passage. Well, I think there's a number of interesting things, but the one that I think is probably the most sort of useful to think about her is there's this really interesting passage where Nick talks about a story he knows about Jordan, and then he sort of unpacks why that's important. He says, "Suddenly I remembered the story about her that had eluded me that night at Daisy's. At her first big golf tournament, there was a row that nearly reached the newspapers, a suggestion that she had moved her ball from a bad lie in the semifinal round. And the witness of it admitted he might have been mistaken. But this is, right, so there's this little shadow, right? And this is what Nick says about it. She was incurably dishonest. She wasn't able to endure being at a disadvantage, and given this unwillingness, I suppose she had begun dealing in subterfuges when she was very young, in order to keep that cool, insolent smile turned to the world, and yet satisfy the demands of her hard, jaunty body." And then interesting, isn't it? And then just after this, they're driving, and she passed so close to some workmen that our fender flicked a button on one man's coat. "You're a rotten driver," I protested. "Either you ought to be more careful or you oughtn't to drive at all." "I am careful." "No, you're not." "Well, other people are," she said lightly. "What's that got to do with it?" "They'll keep out of my way," she insisted. "It takes two to make an accident." And he says, "Suppose you met somebody just as careless as yourself." And she says, "I hope I never will. I hate careless people. That's why I like you." So there's this. It looks just like banter, right, at this point, and you tend to read it and it's really this is just them, having that kind of banterous conversation that people do when they're kind of flirting and stuff with each other. But it ends up foreshadowing when Daisy is going to have that catastrophic crash later on and kill somebody because she's so careless. Right? That whole theme of careless, people who are careless. And so there's this gulf that separates Jordan Baker from Nick Carraway because she's careless just like those people she travels with. Anyways, I find the character kind of interesting because she's part of their world and not. She is and is not part of their world. She's this really in between. And also she's a female character, right? But she's also she's aggressive, physically aggressive in a way that is a little bit like Tom Buchanan.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. You said that phrase that he used to describe this female character that our narrator has nominally a crush on, or at least goes on a few dates with. Her hard, jaunty body.
I'm hip. Yes, I know, right? Like, that's interesting, right?
What a phrase to use to describe a woman's body in a work of literature from this time period,
right?
And
yeah.
And similarly, like there's a discussion about how careless she is that you said. And shortly after that, the bit that I highlighted was he says to himself, or he narrates anyways, but I am slow thinking and full of interior rules that act as brakes on my desires. Mm-hmm. It's like, yes. Happy pride to you too.
Exactly.
This is thinking from the closet that I remember.
No, exactly. And so like the book kind of like flies under the radar because it kind of, you can read that whole passage sort of straight if you really try.
Sure.
But you have to work on it.
Yeah, there's definitely traces.
Yeah. And so like if they taught that in high school, I mean, it would be pretty good.
Are there no other planets like this? No one knows. Perhaps there are, but we only know this one. In any case, it's something extremely rare, unlike Earth. Us, we're common. We're the grass of the universe, and we take pride in our commonness, that it's so widespread, and we thought it could encompass everything. It was a kind of schema we took with us when we set off intrepidly and joyfully on our long journey. Other worlds. But what exactly are they, those other worlds? We'd conquer them, or we'd be conquered. There's nothing else in those wretched brains of ours. It wasn't worth it. It really wasn't. So, Stanisław Lem is one of the most internationally famous and respected writers Poland has produced. And yet, he is wildly underread in America and Canada, even among readers of science fiction, which is the genre that he's most connected to. He's not entirely unknown, but he's treated as kind of a writer's writer, which was enough to put him on my list of authors to check out someday when I was young and reading up on the history of science fiction and reading some science fiction criticism and so forth. But that day turns out to be now. I had an excuse on my other podcast, and if you've already listened to the other podcast, there's going to be some overlap today, but that's okay. There'll be more to say on this one. But anyway, I had an excuse to finally read some Lem, and now I am here to spread the good news about Stanisław Lem. So Lem was born in 1921, and he passed away in 2006. And as I said, he achieved his greatest success writing science fiction novels and short stories in the 50s and 60s, which were generally rooted in philosophical big ideas. And in fact, he also wrote some philosophy. In 1961, he published a book of essays called Summa Technologiae, which I haven't read, but which apparently tries to think through some philosophical questions that might arise and pertain to some far future version of our world where we have things like artificial intelligence and virtual reality and biogenetic engineering and all that.
Oh, dear.
So, yeah, big ideas. And some people are finding them relevant, but I haven't read it, so I can't really speak to that. Lem was really interested in big ideas, and it's that mode of science fiction, I suppose. But he also has kind of a playful approach to them and to language itself, at least as far as I can tell from reading him in translation. In particular, he is widely noted for his love of coining new and often beautifully ridiculous words. But before we get into that, I want to say, have we done much science fiction before?
I don't think so. I was trying to think back. I'm not sure if we've done none. Like we did, it's not really science fiction. We did the Rings of Saturn, which was kind of like...
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a bit of a stretch for science fiction, but it could be.
No, I know. Yeah.
I was thinking we've done some proto-science fiction like The Blazing World or Frankenstein.
Right, that's true. Exactly. But I don't think we've done anything like 20th century science fiction.
Yeah, and we've even looked at a book by Samuel Delany, but not one of his science fiction books.
Yeah, that's right.
So I'm curious, what is your relationship with science fiction as a genre?
Well, it's kind of interesting. It's like, I would say two things about it. One is there's a period of time when I was young where I read like a whole lot of science fiction and absolutely loved it. Like went through a lot of the like sort of the highlights of,
Sure.
but then I didn't return to it. Like I read it in that period and then I haven't read it since then. So it would actually be very interesting going back to some of those and kind of reconnecting with them. But the other thing is that very formative for me, like growing up, was the Star Trek universe, like especially mainly the original series. But I also, as a kid, like I read all the books that were related to it. Like I was really absorbed in the Star Trek universe. So like that was kind of my relationship to science fiction. So it's a genre that I was deeply attached to at one time, but have drifted away from.
And did you ever read anything by Lem, or was he on your radar at all?
No, Lem I did not know about.
Interesting. Yeah, I think if you had grown up in another country, if you'd grown up in, certainly Poland, but if you'd grown up in Germany or Russia, he's huge there. He is ranked somewhere, like what we might think of Heinlein or someone like that as like foundational to the genre and how we think about it. But he just never caught on in the US or Canada to that extent, which is somewhat unfortunate.
Has he gotten more attention more recently?
Not really. I think he's still kind of the connoisseur's choice, so to speak. I don't know. I don't know if his stock has risen or if it's falling off. I know that he's still being kept in print in his English translations, and we'll talk more about that in a second. I think that is an interesting question. I'm not sure. I know I've read him now, so we can add one more reader to that list at least.
Does he tend to write in series? Because I don't know if this is a good generalization or not, but like science fiction is a mode of writing that really opens itself up to series because you create a world, right? So you can dip into that world repeatedly.
Absolutely. So he tends to not write in series, maybe in the way that you're thinking of, but he does have recurring characters, especially in like collected short stories where you have the same characters just having little mini adventures. It's sort of like, I don't know, as Kurt Vonnegut does, for example. You know how Kilgore Trout keeps showing up?
Yeah.
So you have characters like that who reappear throughout some of his works. So his most famous book is probably Solaris, which is from 1961. And Solaris is interesting. It's another short book, so that's good. Nothing against long books, but short books are lovely.
You can eat them at a single sitting.
Exactly. And I love doing that. I think I read Solaris in 2 sittings, and I think that's also true of The Great Gatsby. But, I love it when I read them in a single sitting. So good. All right, Solaris. Our main character is a guy named Chris Kelvin. Fantastic name, no notes. And he's heading off to Solaris, which is a curious planet that he has studied academically quite a lot. But this is going to be his first visit to this planet. The planet has mostly been abandoned by human scientists who've been studying it, but there are a few still remaining there, though it turns out things are going quite a bit oddly there. The planet is notable because it's home to a very alien kind of organism, which is described as an ocean, but an ocean that acts somewhat like a life form. In fact, in the history of people studying this life form, the debate about like its status as one entity, many entities, not an entity at all, was a huge debate for quite a while. Kelvin's dream, like the dream of many who came before him, is to communicate with this life form, with the ocean. But after a recent experiment on the planet, the ocean seems to be trying to communicate with the scientists on the ship in a very odd way. It causes replicas of people that they remember, and remember in a profound way, to appear on the ship, like these odd simulacra.
This is incredibly creepy.
Yes, it is. And like, why is it doing this? Is the ocean even self-aware to know why it would be doing this, or that it's doing anything? How real are the simulacra? And can you stay sane when you're surrounded by a quasi-alive version of, in Kelvin's case, an ex-wife who took her own life when Kelvin left her 10 years earlier?
No.
Yeah.
That's such an interesting premise. That's such an interesting, Yeah.
There's a number of angles you can take to think about this book, and you can tell that because of the movie adaptation of it. So it's been made into a movie a few times, but most notably it was made into a movie by Andrei Tarkovsky in 1971, which a lot of people love. Stanisław Lem was not one of those people. Lem was a little disappointed because the movie upped the romance angle, upped the relationship between Kelvin and this version of his ex-wife. And he was even more distressed when the movie rather than the novel, got remade in 2002 with Steven Soderbergh, starring George Clooney as Chris Kelvin.
Oh, dear.
I have not seen this movie. I am told both that it is better than the trailer makes it out to be, because the trailer you should watch. It is remarkably bad.
Oh dear.
So I've been told that the movie is better than the trailer makes it seem, but also that it's not very good. I don't know. I don't really want to watch it, but
not even for science.
Yeah, exactly. But it really ups the romance in space kind of thing. And Lem was like, that's not what I was interested in at all. I didn't care about the romance in space. I cared about these attempts to communicate with something that is profoundly impossible to communicate with, that is so different from our experience that there is just no way to connect to it. And what would it be like attempting to engage with it? And how can you demonstrate how unbridgeable that gap is?
That's really neat. That makes me want to see it. I mean, it makes me want to see the movie, but also read the book.
You should. And I will say, if you read the book, so I read the translation that came out in 1970. When I read it, I noticed on the first page that it said it was translated from the French by Joanna Kilmartin and Steve Cox. And I thought, wait, what now? This book is not French. This book was written in Polish. It turns out that they translated it from the French translation.
Because they didn't want to do it from Polish?
Yeah, something like that. They couldn't find somebody who would translate it from Polish directly into English, or I don't know why. This is a whole thing. It's called relay translation. I read an academic article that looked at Solaris as the main example of how relay translation can go awry. And as I was reading this book, parts of it just didn't make any sense. And it's because the translators into English did not understand certain passages from the French.
Oh, dear.
Happily, there is a new translation directly from the Polish that came out in 2011 by Bill Johnston, and it's pretty good. It is a much more readable, much more delightful translation from the original, and understands that a series of books would probably not be called the Little Apocrypha. It would be called the Minor Apocrypha.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Those kinds of mistakes that just make a translation very hard to read.
So you're saying read that one?
Definitely read that one. Though I will say, the book was still great. It shone through the interesting ideas, shone through this shoddy translation. So, it's not the end of the world if you end up reading the 1970 translation in English. It's just not nearly as good as the 2011 one.
I love the way you're describing, the scientists' effort to understand what exactly that ocean is. It's kind of functioning like a single sentient being. It's kind of functioning like maybe numerous beings. In other words, it's kind of ungraspable, right? Because it makes itself known through its efforts to know the people, right? But
yes,
you can't really you have no ground to stand on, I guess is what I'm saying, in order to understand what it is.
Right. And the book is not going to explain the lore at the end. It doesn't unfold that way. That's not where we're ending up here. It's and by the way, it turns out it's an ocean and it's mad. No, nothing like that. It is that wall of incomprehensibility that you hit.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, it's very good. It's very good. And I read it and I was like, this is excellent. I want to read more. I want to read more Lem. Because, as I said, this is a writer who I had encountered when I was younger. And there's one book or a series of books of his that the description of it always got me very excited. Lem put out a book in 1971 called A Perfect Vacuum, which is not some sci-fi book about a black hole or anything like that. It's not quite that. What it is a collection of reviews of books which for the most part don't exist.
That's right up your alley.
It so is. And I've known about this book for so many decades, and I only finally got around to reading it. And I had a great time with it. Maybe it's good that I waited because it's entirely what I needed to read right now.
Oh my gosh.
So each book kind of functions as a short story, right? And the reviews and the books are out. They're all different kinds of books and all different kinds of reviewers of the books, let's say. The books, some of them are sci-fi novels or sci-fi adjacent novels. Some of them are philosophical treatises. Some of them are even more. And the first one in the book is, of course, you'll love this, a review of A Perfect Vacuum by Stanisław Lem.
Of course it is.
Of course it is, which I started reading, not realizing it was part of the book. I thought it was an introduction that someone else had written. But then it starts describing things that Lem writes about in his introduction to the book, which do not appear in this chapter.
That's excellent. That is excellent. It makes me think a little bit of Borges. Is it a little bit like that in the self-referentiality?
Yeah, it very much is aware of and taking communion with Borges. Totally. If you enjoy some of the things Borges, you will enjoy this book as well.
This is wild.
It even goes on to mention a chapter of the book, one of the reviews that is not in the book. So that's fun. And as I was reading through the book, I would often go back to the introduction, to like the introduction's review of the review that I had just read. And I realized that sometimes the person who wrote the introduction does not get the review of the book that, like, it reviews it wrong. It presents misinformation. It doesn't quite understand what the person is going at. It takes things as sincere that are ironic or whatever. And like, you understand how that happens, right? Sometimes you reading something and maybe you don't read it carefully enough, or maybe you're stepping into the text with a strong preconceived notion of what's going to be there, some bias or something else, like all the stuff that can happen. You're just having a day. You're having a day. You read the book and now you've got to tell someone about it or write about it because it's your job. And you say something and it's slightly wrong, but you sort of, someone else might see where you're coming from. Like, fascinating, just fascinating to have that go on.
It sounds wild.
It's so good. And also, like, it's interesting to think about how Lem wrote this and why he wrote it. Like, he's writing reviews of books rather than writing the books themselves, you know? I think we've all had that. Yeah. As somebody who's written a few books, especially academic books, have you ever thought it would be just much nicer to write the review of this book that I want to write rather than write the book itself?
I have to confess that it never occurred to me that that was a possible alternative, but I'm really enchanted to know that it is.
Amazing.
Wow.
Some of the books that he writes about are extreme books that you wouldn't really want to write. So like there's one book that kind of tries to out Finnegan's Wake, right? Wants to write about this like deeply pun-based, multiple languages, playful thing, and also comes with like a voluminous apparatus explaining what's going on in the book. Imagine if Ulysses or Finnegan's Wake came with an exhaustive annotation. It's a fun chapter. It's a fun send-up of some of the enthusiastic modes of interpretation that James Joyce's Finnegan's Wake sometimes gets. And my goodness, someday we will talk about that book in more detail. But
wow.
But anyway, a lot of the books are also just books that Lem probably could have just written. But instead, we get the summaries of the books.
You know, it's kind of like, it's incredibly playful and ironic and so on, but like, what do you think he's up to? Like, what is achieved by doing a review of the book? Like, so you have this oblique representation of the book rather than the book itself. Like, it's kind of interesting. You think about like, what is that doing in terms of like, I don't know, displacing the book itself?
Yeah. Yeah. Have you ever seen the film Metropolitan?
No.
I think it's from like 1990. It's by Whit Stillman, who's gone on to make some truly bad movies. I don't know if I'm recommending Metropolitan or not, but one bit of dialogue from it always stuck with me. It's two people talking at like a high society, Upper East Side kind of thing, and young people. And one of them at this party asks another one, like, what Jane Austen novels have you read? And the guy says, none. I don't read novels. I prefer good literary criticism. That way you get both the novelist's ideas as well as the critic's thinking. Like, so you're getting like multi-level approaches. And indeed, in some of these reviews, you have both the author's perspective and what the author is trying to do, and then the critic's doubts about it, undercutting these ideas. And then sometimes you also have that like introductory reviewer also going off about it. So it becomes this way of presenting ideas with their critique in a nuanced way that like really fleshes them out in a way that just encountering the actual book might not.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of paradoxical, right? Because like you said, the critique fleshes it out in a way that just encountering the book itself would not. And yet also because the actual book, like not merely is not there, like it does not exist. It's always like on the horizon, right? Like it's always never accessible.
Exactly.
So that's really cool.
And like the whole thing, in addition to like the ideas that are in some of these fictional books, you know, the sort of science fictional big ideas that they get to play with about identity and some of the other stuff, you know, some of the technological stuff that we've talked about. Like, so like those core ideas, the things that you got from my description of Solaris are coming out in this book, where you get that core idea without having to sit through 100, 200, 5,000 in some cases pages of book. So that's really interesting. But it also creates this kind of wild narcotic effect sometimes when you're going through, especially with that introduction and all these different layers of fakery and illusion and like, what am I doing? What am I reading? What is the thing that I'm walking away with? Like, it was dizzying and delightfully so at times to be engaging with this type of metacriticism.
That sounds wild.
It reminded me of another book that I read a while ago, which I imagine you've heard of. It's called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read.
I've heard of this, but I haven't seen it.
Well, you don't need to have seen it to talk about it, it turns out. It's by a French literary theorist and academic called Pierre Bayard. It came out in 2007. It's a fun little book. Again, a little book you can probably read in one sitting. Very breezy. He categorizes the world of books into a few different categories. Books that you've never opened, books that you've skimmed, books that you've heard about but that you've never read, and books that you've read but you've forgotten. The idea of a category of books that you've read is sort of interestingly not there because, of course, while you're reading a book, you're forgetting about it as you're reading it. You can't retain it perfectly. You can't retain that moment of reading forever. It is as unattainable as Daisy, right?
Yeah.
Like that thing that we think of as reading a book is kind of a horizon and you're always sort of going towards it or you're touching it very briefly, but then it like, so like what is reading and like, what is the difference between reading a book and not reading a book? And so listeners, you are listening to a podcast about a book that is a collection of reviews of books that don't exist. And yet, listeners, are you getting something out of it? Is some meaning being transferred? Is some aesthetic equivalent? And like, how does that meaning differ from reading the book? It's so wild. I was so happy.
Yeah, no, it's wonderful. And it's neat too to like in the way it opens up for you to think about how is this phenomenon that you're describing with regard to books, you know, like where you can know it in all these different kinds of ways, comparable to what the experience of film is like. Because we do that all the time, right? We describe something we've seen to somebody else and like they won't have maybe seen that film that you're describing, but because I've described it to them, they have something. Like there's something that they've got, right?
Yeah.
Or they've read about it or whatever. And so thinking about how that works for books versus how that works for film or other kinds of art, right? That's kind of neat to think about.
Yeah, yeah. And also just like, I don't know, enriching my sense of reading it. Like what's the difference between having read The Great Gatsby, like literally having every word gone through my eyes, so to speak, and my understanding of The Great Gatsby as it was beforehand, what it will be in a few months when I've even more of the details have washed away than when I finished reading it a week or two ago. And also what it would be like if I had recorded this conversation with you without having read the book and you had enriched my sense of what the book is by going into it for so long without me reading it. Or like, again, the experience of a listener who might be listening to this who hasn't read any of these books we're talking about, but still is walking away a little closer to that mythical state of having read.
Yeah, no, 'cause I'm thinking about all the like comparison points here. Like we were talking a moment ago about like film, but also like travel, right? Like so, like we when we talk about, for example, I'm just thinking about medieval travel literature, just because I know the genre pretty well, right? And sometimes it's about describing a place because it's useful to know what this place would be like because you might go there. But a lot of times it's about describing a place in order to make it accessible to you, even though you may never go there, right? And sometimes in a way, just like these are wonders or curiosities or neat things you might like to know about, or because there's a certain kind of devotional or emotional or spiritual value that comes from this imaginative itinerary, right? So like, this is kind of opening up the different ways in which knowledge of books proceeds, right? And you were describing how that is, for example, with the experience of reading Gatsby, for example. But there's also that sort of multi-level experience that comes from reading a book that you've read before, especially if you read it in another phase of your own life. Because you end up with this very layered kind of experience that is something like visiting a place again that you knew, let's say, 10 or 20 years ago.
Oh, exactly. What is it going to be like when I reread A Perfect Vacuum in a few years?
Well, you know.
Also, I will say Pierre Bayard also put out a book, which has been translated into English, called How to Talk About Places You've Never Been, on the importance of armchair travel.
Of course he has. You see?
Which, it's not as good as the books you haven't read book, but it's still, I am still glad I poked through it. It's short, whatever. I read it. It's fun. Yeah. I don't know. It hit me real hard. And it's fascinating that a book of fake reviews can be such a roller coaster and head trip to read.
It sounds absolutely delightful.
We should talk a little bit more about what else has been going on in our lives to unwind from that. I want to just say real quick, because we mentioned Pierre Bayard, and he has some books that I haven't read, but one of his sort of newest hobbies, I guess, or he's put out a few of these books, is books where he goes back to a classic mystery novel, such as Hound of the Baskervilles or Who Killed Roger Ackroyd or And Then There Were None. And then he puts out a little book where he argues that the solution to the mystery, as presented by the actual authors of the book, is wrong.
How delightful.
And he gives evidence for another thing, isn't it? Like, it could be really bad. It could be super cloying. But, like, I think that's a really fun idea.
Yeah, that is delightful.
I do want to kind of check one of those out and see how he does it.
Yes, definitely. Actually, that's great. And I hope we will get a chance to do some more mystery reading together, because that's something we started opening up in the last little while. And I think it's super fun.
Yeah.
Like we did Dorothy Sayers' The Night Tailors. You did Hound of the Baskervilles. So that would be cool to maybe pick up an Agatha Christie or something like that.
So that was just a little note that I wanted to add there. I don't feel like I've done anything particularly interesting lately. Feels like it's been a lot of busy work preparing for some travel that I'm going to be doing soon. Although I will say I'm going to be traveling to London in a little bit, and I'm super excited because whenever I travel, I do try to make it a point to go to local bookstores of note. You know me. And so, and I've been to London before. It's a fabulous city. There are some really great bookstores. I am very much looking forward to going back to some of them and buying more books to add to my vast and unwieldy collection of books that I haven't read but might still talk about.
That will be great to hear about. And since you haven't been there for a few years, it'll be neat to hear about how it's different and how it's the same.
Indeed.
Actually, I just got back yesterday from traveling. I was in Berlin and in Edinburgh. So in one case, a city I've been to many, many times. And in the other case, a city I was visiting for the first time. And would love to go back. It was actually really lovely.
Yeah, I've been to Glasgow, but I've never been to Edinburgh.
It was beautiful. I would gladly go back. I was only there for like literally 36 hours because it was a work thing. But I would love to go back sometime.
And you were back in Berlin. Did you go visit the Humboldt?
Yeah, I was at the Humboldt Forum and also at the storage facility of the Ethnological Museum in Berlin, and also at a regional museum that's near Dresden, and also a museum in Edinburgh. And that was part of a collaboration with members of Munsee communities, visiting with belongings from those communities. And it would be neat to find the opportunity to talk some more about that. You know, we talked a little bit about the world of museums and the ways in which that's changing when we talked about Margarete von Oswald's book about the museum in Berlin. And so maybe we'll find the opportunity to kind of unfold some of that story, the world of the museum a little bit more.
Is there one little tasting note that you can give right now that was particularly something that struck you or was exciting?
Well, one thing that was super fascinating, and I think this might be fun to talk about at some point if there's a book that pulls out some of these strands, is the ways in which these big universal museums, like the British Museum or like the Ethnological Museum in Berlin or the American Museum of Natural History in New York, these are kind of universal museums, right? That kind of each one is different in some ways, but they're all kind of the same. And so they have a kind of shared aspiration to capaciousness or universality. But there's also these small regional museums that have a very different quality. You would think that they have limitations because they don't have these big conservation staffs and so on. And that's true. But they provide a different kind of more intimate care. And they also are telling this museum story in a very different kind of way, often organized around one particular sort of heroic figure and attaching the collection to I want to say almost kind of mythos, or even kind of almost like saint's life sometimes of the figure that they're commemorating. So one of these was the Karl May Museum, or in English it would look like Karl May Museum in Radebeul, Germany, which is sort of celebrating an author of the early 20th century. He's particularly known for his Wild West stories.
Oh, yes. I've heard a little bit about this person because it's like super weird German version of America that sounds very intriguing. And like he was super popular, as I understand.
He continues to be popular to a certain extent in Germany. And so maybe we might pull out one of his books and go on that wild ride if we want to at some point. And then when I was in Scotland, we were making a visit to the David Livingstone birthplace, which is dedicated to, this missionary, explorer, doctor, person. And this particular belonging that we're visiting was from a North American indigenous community, from Munsee community, but had been given by somebody at some point in the 20th century to this museum that has African artifacts because they're like, yeah, that stuff's kind of all the same.
Wow.
So that's why it's weird. Yes, right? So there's a real story there as well.
Amazing.
Yeah, maybe we'll have the chance to unpack the museum side, or else maybe we'll get it through Karl May. That would also be really delightful.
Well, listeners have probably heard all the chirping going on in the background where you are. You're currently doing your summering at the Cape.
Yeah, I'm out in North Truro, where we were together one time. I wish we would do that again sometime, where we recorded on the road years ago.
Yeah.
I think we did. Was it our Tempest episode we did here, I think?
I think it was. That's what I'm remembering as well. Yeah. It was a lovely visit. Do you have any good beach reading that you're looking forward to getting to read while you're there?
Well, actually, I think my next reading is actually maybe going to be Forgetting Elena. I would like to read that again because the last time I read it, I was a different person. So we'll see what it's like for today, Suzanne, to read.
Fabulous. Okay. Well, on that note, listeners, I think that's going to be it for today. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at spouter@megaphonic.fm. We'd always love to hear from you. And this show was made possible by listeners like you supporting us on Patreon. And patrons get to hang out with us in a friendly Discord. So find out more at patreon.com/megaphonic. Show notes with links for anything we've mentioned in this episode are at megaphonic.fm/spouter/82. And the Spouter-Inn is one of the fancy little podcasts over at megaphonic.fm. So until next time.
Till next time, see you again at the Spouter-Inn.